the dust of tombstone. Arizona was a fine, red powder that coated everything. It settled on the brims of hats, crept into the folds of worn denim, and clung to the back of a man's throat like a persistent sin. In the summer of 1875, the sun beat down on the town with a merciless, white-hot fury, bleaching the color from the wooden storefronts and making the very air shimmer above the main street. It was a heat that baked the good intentions out of a man and left only a thirst for whiskey and shade. Jake Carver had found a sliver of shade under the awning of the general store, but it offered little relief. He leaned against the rough-hewn wood, his hat tipped low over his eyes, watching the town's ugly heart beat in the open square. They called it a public auction, a sale of assets seized by the territorial militia. But Jake, who had seen his share of the world's deceptions, knew it for what it was: a market for human souls, dressed up in the thin veil of legality. He was just passing through, headed south toward the border to deliver a small herd of cattle for a rancher near Tucson. Tombstone was supposed to be a place to restock his supplies, rest his horse, and drink a beer that wasn't lukewarm. He had not counted on this. On a crude wooden platform stood a man in a sweat-stained bowler hat, his voice a grating carnival bark that cut through the afternoon stupor. He was selling people. Apache men, women, and children. Captured in a recent raid the Army called a pacification. The men, proud warriors with eyes that burned with a fire the sun could not extinguish, were sold to mines and ranches as indentured labor. The women, some clutching infants, were sold as house servants. The auctioneer used words like hardy and compliant, but his eyes held the flat, cold look of a man selling livestock. Jake felt a familiar weariness settle deep in his bones. It was the same exhaustion that had followed him since the war, a soul-deep fatigue with the casual cruelty of men. He had fought for a cause he no longer understood, under a flag that now lay folded in a museum, and had seen enough blood and injustice to last a dozen lifetimes. He had tried to outrun it, riding from one dusty corner of the country to another, but it seemed the world was determined to keep showing him its ugliest face. He watched as a young woman was pushed onto the platform. She was maybe 20 years old, her black hair unbound and falling like a sheet of polished obsidian down her back. She wore a simple deerskin dress, torn at the shoulder. Her hands were bound in front of her with a length of coarse rope. Unlike the others, who met the crowd's leering gaze with defiant glares or stoic emptiness, she simply stared at the distant Dragoon Mountains, as if the dusty, jeering crowd below her did not exist. There was a stillness about her, a profound dignity that seemed to create a space of silence around her on the noisy platform. "Now this one," the auctioneer began, his voice dripping with disdain. "This one, gentlemen, is a special case. She's called Ilana, stubborn, useless for hard labor. The soldiers say barely speaks a word of English. Good for mending, maybe, if you can get her to sit still." He prodded her shoulder with a grimy finger. She did not flinch. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon. The crowd chuckled. A few miners, their faces caked with dust and their pockets light, shouted crude remarks. Jake's hand, resting near the butt of his Colt, tightened. "We'll start the bidding at $10, the auctioneer announced. Silence. The only sounds were the buzzing of flies and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. $10 was a week's wages for some of these men. They could buy a good mule for that, an animal that would actually work. $10 for this fine specimen, the auctioneer wheezed, his smile faltering. "Come now, she's got a strong back." "Looks half-starved to me." "Miller!" a man shouted from the crowd. "She's a fighter. Is she another one?" yelled, followed by a wave of laughter. "I like a fighter." His comment was thick with a dark meaning that made Jake's stomach clench. The auctioneer, Miller, wiped his brow with a handkerchief. "All right, $5 then. $5. For the love of God, I have to get her off my hands." The crowd only shifted its feet. The sun was too hot. The whiskey in the saloons was too close. and the woman on the stage was too proud, too unbroken. She was not the kind of purchase a man made for simple house chores. She was trouble. Her silence was louder than any plea. Miller's face turned a blotchy red. He was losing the crowd, losing his dignity. "All right, you vultures," he spat. $2, 2 silver dollars. That's less than the price of a decent bottle of whiskey. $2, and you can take her home. A new kind of silence fell over the square. It was a heavy, predatory quiet. $2 was not a price. It was an insult. It stripped away the last pretense of a legitimate transaction and laid bare the rotten core of the event. For $2, a man wasn't buying a servant. He was buying a thing to be used and discarded. Jake heard the men standing near the saloon doors begin to mutter amongst themselves. He saw the way their eyes moved over the girl on the platform, the hungry, thoughtless cruelty in their expressions. He knew that look. He had seen it in the eyes of desperate soldiers on a battlefield and in the faces of men who had lost all touch with their own humanity. He knew what would happen to her if one of them threw down $2 as a drunken joke. He pushed himself off the wall. His spurs made a soft, lonely sound in the dust as he walked toward the platform. He didn't push through the crowd. They simply parted for him, sensing a shift in the afternoon's lazy rhythm. He stopped about 20 feet from the platform, his gaze fixed on the auctioneer. $2, Jake said. His voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried across the square like the tolling of a church bell. Every head turned toward him. The auctioneer squinted, then a slow, greasy smile spread across his face. He saw a lone cowboy, dusty and anonymous, a man no one knew. An easy mark. "Well now, looks like we have a bidder," Miller boomed. Playing to the crowd, $2 from the cowboy. "Do I hear 3? Anyone want to offer 3 for this wildcat?" The men from the saloon eyed Jake, their smirks turning into sullen glares. But there was something in the way Jake stood, a kind of rooted stillness that made them hesitate. He wasn't a big man, but he was built with a lean, hard economy of motion that suggested he knew how to handle himself. His gear was well worn but cared for, and the Colt peacemaker strapped to his hip looked less like an ornament and more like a tool he used with quiet competence. "Going once," Miller called out, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Going twice." He paused, hoping for a last-minute spark of competitive cruelty from the other men. None came. "Sold," he declared, banging a small wooden gavel against the platform. To the cowboy in the dusty hat for $2. Jake walked to the side of the platform and pulled 2 heavy silver dollars from his pocket. They were warm from the sun. He dropped them into the auctioneer's outstretched palm. Miller's fingers, soft and damp, closed around them. "She ain't worth more than $2. "Cowboy," Miller said with a conspiratorial wink, as if they were partners in the same shabby crime. "You know that, right?" Jake looked from the coins in Miller's hand up to the man's face, and then his gaze drifted to the girl, who was now being led down the steps by a deputy. For the first time, her eyes left the mountains and met his. They were dark and deep, and in them he saw not fear or gratitude, but a profound, bottomless sorrow. "Maybe not to you," Jake said, his voice low and flat, "but she's worth a man's conscience." He took the end of the rope from the deputy, his fingers brushing against the rough fibers. The rope felt obscene in his hand. He gave it a gentle tug, a silent instruction for her to follow. She walked behind him, her steps light and silent in the dust, as he led her away from the square and toward the livery stable where he had left his horse. The murmuring of the crowd followed them, a wave of curiosity and contempt. His plan was simple. He would get his horse, ride a few miles out of town, and cut the rope from her wrists. He would give her the small canteen of water from his saddlebag and point her south, toward the mountains she had been staring at, toward home. She was not his problem. He had bought her to prevent a greater evil, and once that was done, his responsibility ended. It was a clean, simple transaction in his mind. But Tombstone was not a simple place. As he was paying the stablemaster for his horse, a shadow fell over the doorway. It was the town sheriff, a man with a drooping mustache and a tin star pinned to a stained vest. He was flanked by 2 deputies. "Carver, is it the sheriff?" asked, his voice lazy but his eyes sharp. "That's my name," Jake replied, cinching the saddle on his horse, a sturdy buckskin. "Just want to make sure you understand the law here." "Son," the sheriff said, hooking his thumbs in his belt, "that Apache girl, she's your property now, indentured. According to Territorial Mandate 301, that means you're responsible for her." Jake paused, his hand on the saddle horn. "Responsible how?" "Responsible for her food, her shelter, and her conduct. If she runs off, you report it. We'll hunt her down as a fugitive. If you are found to have willingly let her go, well, that's aiding a fugitive and inciting vagrancy. That'll get you 6 months on a chain gang, breaking rocks in this beautiful sunshine." The sheriff smiled, but it didn't reach his cold eyes. "We like to keep things orderly here in Tombstone. Can't have property just wandering off. It's bad for business." Jake felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The clean, simple transaction had just become a tangled mess. He looked over at the Apache girl, Ilana. She was standing by a water trough, her back to them, still as a statue. She had not said a word, had not made a sound. He had not freed her. He had only changed the name of her owner. For $2, he had bought himself a cage. He swung himself up into the saddle. He reached down and offered her his hand. For a long moment, she just looked at it. Then, with a fluid grace that surprised him, she placed her bound hands in his and let him pull her up to sit behind him on the horse. Her weight was slight, almost nothing. As they rode out of Tombstone, the setting sun painted the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. The dust kicked up by the horse's hooves glowed in the fading light. Jake could feel her behind him, her posture rigid, her presence a silent, searing question he had no idea how to answer. The road south stretched out before them, a dusty ribbon leading into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. They were 2 strangers, a man running from his past and a woman stolen from her future, bound together by $2 silver and the hypocritical laws of a savage land. The heat of the day was beginning to fade, but Jake Carver knew a different kind of fire was just beginning to burn. The silence that rode with them out of Tombstone was heavier than the desert heat. Jake felt Ilana's presence behind him on the buckskin, a rigid, watchful weight that barely seemed to breathe. He kept his eyes on the trail, a dusty path winding through saguaro and cholla cactus that stood like silent sentinels in the twilight. The mountains she had stared at from the auction block were now cast in deep purple shadow against a blood-orange sky. He rode for a full hour, until the last glint of the town's windows was swallowed by the rolling landscape. Only then did he pull the horse to a halt in a shallow wash, screened from the main trail by a thicket of mesquite. He slid from the saddle and turned to face her. In the dim light, her expression was unreadable, a mask of stoic calm. He expected fear or anger, but saw only a deep, weary stillness. He gestured for her to dismount. She did so with an effortless grace, landing softly on the sand. He reached for the rope that bound her wrists, and she flinched. A small, almost imperceptible movement, the first crack in her composure. "It is okay," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He held up his hands to show he meant no harm, then pulled the Bowie knife from the sheath on his belt. The blade gleamed in the last of the light. He saw her eyes follow it, her body tensing. He carefully turned the knife and sawed through the coarse rope with the dull backside of the blade, not wanting to risk cutting her. When the fibers parted, the rope fell away into the dust. She stood there for a moment, rubbing her wrists where the rope had chafed them raw. She did not thank him. She simply watched him, her dark eyes searching his face for the truth behind the act. He understood. Kindness from a white man was a currency she had likely never known. His plan to simply point her toward Mexico now seemed foolish, a naive fantasy cooked up in the heat of the moment. Leaving her here, alone, at night, with no food or water, was no better than what the men in Tombstone would have done. The sheriff's words echoed in his head. He was responsible. "We will camp here," he said, pointing to the ground. He used simple words, hoping she might understand a few. "Sleep, morning. We ride south. Mexico." He pointed south. "You will be free." She gave no sign that she understood his words, but she watched his every move as he unsaddled the horse and set up a small camp. He built a fire, not for warmth, but for the small circle of light it pushed back against the immense, star-filled darkness. The desert night was alive with sounds, the yip of a distant coyote, the rustle of unseen things in the brush. He took out a parcel of jerky and a piece of hardtack from his saddlebag and offered it to her. She hesitated, then took it, her fingers barely brushing his. They ate in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the soft chewing. When they were done, he handed her his canteen. She drank sparingly, then handed it back. He laid out his bedroll on one side of the fire and gestured for her to rest on the other. He took his rifle and sat with his back against a rock, taking the first watch. He did not expect her to trust him enough to sleep, but after an hour, he saw her lie down, curling into a tight ball. Though he knew she was not asleep, he watched the flames dance and thought about the strange turn his life had taken in the space of an afternoon. He had ridden into Tombstone a free man, beholden to no one. He was riding out with the life of another human being in his hands, a life he had purchased for the price of a cheap bottle of whiskey. The irony was as bitter as alkali dust. The next 3 days fell into a pattern. They rose before the sun, ate a sparse meal, and rode south, chasing the horizon. The heat was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on them, and the silence between them remained vast and unbroken. Jake tried a few times to speak to her, using simple words, pointing at things, horse, sky, water. She would sometimes nod, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she offered no words of her own. He learned to read her in other ways, in the subtle shifts of her posture, the way her eyes scanned the terrain, missing nothing. She was more at home in this harsh landscape than he was. On the 4th day, the sky turned a sickly yellow. The wind, which had been a constant, hot breath, picked up, whining through the canyons and whipping sand into their faces. A sandstorm. Jake had been caught in one before and knew how dangerous it could be. Visibility would drop to nothing, and the stinging, abrasive sand could strip a man's skin raw. "We need shelter," he yelled over the rising wind, pulling the bandana over his nose and mouth. He scouted frantically, his eyes stinging, and finally spotted a low bluff, a wall of rock that might offer some protection on its leeward side. He urged the horse forward, the animal whinnying in protest as the full force of the storm hit them. It was a maelstrom of sand and fury. He got them into the shallow shelter of the rock face, pulling the horse in as close as he could. He dismounted and helped Alana down, pushing her against the rock wall. The wind howled like a banshee, and the sand scoured everything. He took his heavy wool blanket from his bedroll and, without thinking, draped it over both of them, huddling close to shield her from the worst of the blast. Under the blanket, in the roaring, sandy darkness, he could feel the slight tremor of her body. For a long while they just stood there, two small figures pressed together against the rage of the desert. He was acutely aware of her closeness, the feeling of her hair brushing his cheek, the shared, desperate fight for breath in the suffocating dust. When the storm finally passed hours later, leaving behind a world remade in sculpted drifts of sand, something between them had shifted. The space that separated them was no longer a chasm. Their next trial came 2 days later. They were tracking through a narrow, rocky canyon when two men stepped out from behind a cluster of boulders. rifles held loosely but ready. They were prospectors by the look of them, gaunt and ragged, with the wild, desperate eyes of men who had found nothing but disappointment in the earth. "Well, look what we got here," Ben, the taller one, said, showing a row of yellow teeth. "A traveler, and he's got himself a squaw." Jake's hand moved instinctively to rest on the butt of his Colt. "Keep riding," he said, his voice level. "We do not want any trouble." "We do not want trouble either. The second man," Ben said with a wet chuckle. "We just want to trade that rifle of yours, your horse, and the girl. We will give you a fair price for the girl." "She is not for sale," Jake said, his eyes cold as ice. The first man raised his rifle slightly. "Everything's for sale out here, friend, especially her kind. Now get down off that horse nice and slow." What happened next was a blur of deadly economy. Jake did not draw his pistol. Instead, he spurred his horse forward, straight at the two men. The sudden charge took them by surprise. As the horse closed the distance, Jake swung his leg over the saddle, dropping to the ground in a fluid motion. He hit the ground running, slamming his shoulder into the taller man, sending him sprawling. The man's rifle discharged into the air. Jake's fist connected with the man's jaw in a short, brutal arc, and the man went limp. Ben, the second prospector, was fumbling to bring his rifle to bear when Alana acted. She slid from the horse's back and scooped up a rock the size of her fist, with a speed that stunned Jake. She lunged at the man and brought the rock down hard on his gun hand. The man screamed as bones crunched and the rifle clattered to the ground. She stood over him, the rock raised again, her face a mask of cold fury. Jake grabbed her arm. "That is enough," he said gently. She looked at him, her chest heaving, the fire in her eyes slowly banking. He took the rifles from the two groaning men, emptied them, and tossed them high onto a rock ledge where they would be difficult to retrieve. He left the men their canteens, but took their meager supply of food. "Let us go," he said, helping her back onto the horse. They rode away, leaving the two men to nurse their wounds and their foolishness. That night, as they made camp, he noticed a long, bloody gash on his forearm, a scrape from the fall he had not felt in the heat of the moment. He was washing it in the firelight when Alana came over to him. She knelt and gestured for him to give her his arm. When he hesitated, she simply took it, her touch surprisingly gentle. She looked at the wound, then went into the darkness and returned with a handful of leaves from a specific bush. She chewed them into a green pulp and carefully applied the makeshift poultice to the cut before wrapping it with a strip of cloth torn from her own dress. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him, and for the first time, she spoke a full sentence in English, her voice soft and low. "You fight for me." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, of wonder. They were wrong, was all he could say. A few nights later, he saw her holding a small object, a piece of carved wood tied to a leather thong. He recognized the symbol carved into it, a stylized eagle. He had seen it on the standards of a Chiricahua chief his company had once been ordered to track. "Your father?" he asked, pointing to the carving. She clutched it tightly and nodded. "My father is chief." She looked up at him, and the story came out in broken pieces, a painful mosaic of English words she had learned from missionaries and gestures that filled in the gaps. She spoke of white soldiers, men in blue coats, who came with a paper, a treaty, she said, the words sounding foreign on her tongue. They promised peace, food for the winter, a place where her people could live, safe from the miners and the ranchers. Her father had believed them. He had led his people down from the mountains. It was a trap. They separated the men from the women, shot those who resisted, and marched the rest of them north. She had been sold in Tombstone, betrayed. As she spoke, Jake felt a ghost climb his spine. He remembered a similar scene from the war, not one he took part in, but one he had witnessed from a distance. A village of Cherokees in Tennessee, neutral in the war, who had been promised protection by a Union colonel. He remembered seeing the smoke rising over the trees, smelling the ugly scent of a promise being broken. He had been just a boy then, a soldier following orders, but the image was seared into his memory. He had told himself it was the way of the world, the ugly price of progress. Now, looking at Ilana, at the profound pain in her eyes, he saw it not as history, but as a fresh wound. The $2 he had paid for her felt like a brand on his soul. He had not saved her from injustice. He had merely participated in its final, grubby transaction. The road to Mexico was still their path, but Jake knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that this journey was no longer about setting her free. It was about finding some way, any way, to free himself. The landscape south of the canyon was a different kind of empty. The jagged rocks gave way to vast, open plains of pale sand and scrub brush, a place so wide and quiet it felt like the floor of the sky. The silence was no longer a wall between them, but a space they shared, a language of its own. In the evenings, after the sun had bled its colors across the western horizon and the first stars pricked the deep indigo dome of the night, they would sit by the fire, and the world would shrink to that small, flickering circle of light. It was in the firelight that they began to build a bridge of words. Jake started it, pointing with a stick at the flames. "Fire," he said, his voice clear in the still air. Ilana watched his lips form the word. She looked at the dancing flames, then back at him. "Fire," she repeated softly. The sound was strange in her mouth, but she said it perfectly. Then she touched the ground beside her and said a word in her own tongue, a sound like a soft stone rolling. "Ko." Jake tried to repeat it, his tongue fumbling with the sound. "Ko." A small smile touched the corners of her mouth, the first he had ever seen. It transformed her face, softening the hard lines of grief and weariness. He felt his own lips curve in response. He pointed the stick at the moon, a perfect silver disk hanging in the darkness. "Moon," he said. "Moon," she echoed. Then she offered her word for it, a series of soft, melodic syllables. He tried to repeat it, and this time his attempt was so clumsy that a quiet laugh escaped her. It was a sound like wind chimes, and it made something in his chest ache. Night after night, the lessons continued. He taught her rock, star, horse, water. She gave him the Chiricahua words in return, her voice patient as she corrected his rough pronunciation. He learned that NDE meant man, and Itzan meant woman. When he first pointed to himself and said Ende, she simply nodded. But when he pointed to her and said Itzan, a flicker of something, perhaps pride, moved in her dark eyes. It was a quiet acknowledgement that he saw her for what she was, not what the men in Tombstone had tried to make her. The words unlocked more than just communication. They unlocked memories. One night, while he was cleaning his pistol by the fire, she pointed at the intricate pattern on the grip. "My brother," he found himself saying, the words coming out before he had thought them through. "He carved this before the war." He told her about his family's small farm in Missouri, about the creek where he and his brother used to fish, about the smell of his mother's baking on a winter morning. They were simple memories, from a life that felt like it belonged to another man, a man who had not yet seen the world's capacity for cruelty. She listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, and he felt as if he were pulling these old, dusty pieces of his soul out into the light for the first time in years. Another night, she pointed to a cluster of 7 bright stars in the sky. She spoke in a mix of her language and the few English words she now knew. She told him a story about 7 sisters who were chased by a great bear, and how the Great Spirit had lifted them into the sky to keep them safe. Her hands moved as she spoke, creating images in the air, her voice a low, mesmerizing hum. He did not understand every word, but he understood the heart of the story, a tale of fear and salvation written in the stars. He was seeing a piece of her world, a world rich with meaning and spirit, a world that had been shattered but not destroyed. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a fire. They were two people sharing the fragments of their broken lives. The desert nights were cold, and the darkness was absolute. It was a darkness that could feel like a comforting blanket or a suffocating shroud. For Ilana, it often held terror. Jake had noticed she slept lightly, her body tense even in repose. Then came the night when the past came for her in her sleep. He was on watch. The fire burned down to a bed of glowing red embers, his rifle resting across his lap. The desert was quiet, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind. He heard a noise from her, a small, choked gasp. He looked over and saw her wrapped in her blanket, her body jerking. A low moan escaped her lips, a sound of pure anguish. She was caught in a nightmare, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides as if fighting off an unseen attacker. His first instinct was to go to her, to wake her, but he hesitated. He had seen men in the army gripped by night terrors, their minds trapped on a bloody battlefield miles and years away. Waking them could be dangerous, for them and for the person waking them. He watched for another moment, his heart twisting at the raw pain in the sound she made. He could not just sit there and let her suffer. He rose silently and knelt beside her. The embers cast a faint, pulsing red glow on her face, illuminating the sheen of sweat on her brow and the tormented furrow between her eyes. "Ilana," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. She did not respond, her breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He reached out and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. The effect was instantaneous. Her eyes flew open, wide and black with terror. She scrambled backwards with a cry, a wild, cornered sound, her hands coming up to defend herself. He did not move. He kept his hand outstretched, palm open, showing he had no weapon, no ill intent. "It is all right," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. "You are safe. It was a dream." Her eyes darted around the campsite, taking in the familiar shapes of the rocks, the glowing embers, the horse standing patiently nearby. She looked at him, her chest still heaving, and the terror slowly receded, replaced by a deep, shuddering exhaustion. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, making herself small. "They come," she whispered, the words so quiet he could barely hear them. "The blue coats." He understood. He sat down on the sand a few feet from her, giving her space, but letting her know he was not leaving. He did not say that the blue coats were gone, or that she was safe now. He knew those were just words, and words were useless against the kind of memories that haunted her. Instead, he just sat there, a silent witness to her pain. He picked up a stick and began to draw meaningless patterns in the sand, a simple, repetitive motion that seemed to calm the air between them. After a long while, her trembling subsided. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the dying red light of the embers. There was no fear in them now, only a profound and heartbreaking sorrow. She did not thank him. She did not have to. In the shared silence, in the space between a nightmare and the dawn, a new and powerful understanding had taken root. He stayed there until her breathing evened out and she finally drifted back to sleep, a true and peaceful sleep this time. He watched over her, the rifle forgotten on the ground beside him. He looked at her face, no longer a mask of stoic pride or a canvas of terror, but simply the face of a woman, a human being who had suffered immensely. In that moment, Jake Carver realized the truth. She was not a $2 slave. She was not his property. She was not a legal problem he had to solve at the Mexican border. She was Ilana. She was a chief's daughter who told stories about the stars. She was a woman who could laugh at his clumsy attempts to speak her language and who knew how to heal a wound with leaves from a desert bush. She was a soul as deep and as scarred as his own. He had paid $2 not for a life, but for the privilege of witnessing one, of protecting one. The weight of that responsibility settled over him. No longer a burden, but a purpose, a reason to keep riding south. He looked up at the vast, star-filled sky, then back at the woman sleeping by the fire. A single ember flared, a tiny spark of brilliant orange, and he saw it reflected in a tear that traced a silent path through the dust on her cheek. It was a small, stubborn light in an ocean of darkness, a symbol of life. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt a flicker of hope. The thin silver line of a river appeared on the distant southern horizon, a promise of water and a border they could cross to a new life. In the 2 weeks since the canyon ambush, a fragile peace had settled over them. They spoke more freely now, a clumsy but effective mix of his English and her Apache, stitched together with gestures and a shared understanding that ran deeper than words. They rode not as captor and captive, but as partners in a desperate journey. Jake had even taught her how to handle his spare revolver, an old Navy Colt. She was a natural, her hands steady, her eyes sharp. The trust it took to place a loaded weapon in her hands was a more powerful statement than any promise he could make. He found himself watching her, noticing the small things, the way she tilted her head to listen to the whisper of the wind, the efficiency of her movements as she set up camp, the quiet resilience that radiated from her like heat from the desert floor. The $2 he had spent felt like a lifetime ago, a foolish and insignificant sum. He was no longer just taking her to Mexico. He was taking Ilana. And that simple fact had changed everything. They were making their way through a series of low, rolling hills dotted with ocotillo and prickly pear when he saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the morning sun. Blue uniforms, Army patrol. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, seized him. He pulled his horse to a halt behind a rise, his hand going to the Colt on his hip. "Soldiers," he said, the word a harsh whisper. Ilana saw them too, all the warmth and life drained from her face, leaving behind the stoic, empty mask she had worn on the auction block. It was as if she had retreated to a place deep inside herself where no one could reach her. The sight of it sent a hot spike of anger through him. He had 2 choices. He could try to outrun them, but their horses looked fresh and the open terrain offered little cover. Or he could try to bluff his way through. They were still miles from the border, still well within United States territory. He was a white man, and that still counted for something. "Stay calm," he told her, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. "Let me do the talking." He urged the horse forward, moving at a slow, non-threatening walk. The soldiers saw them and changed course, trotting to intercept them. They fanned out as they approached, a standard military formation. The man in the lead, a corporal with a sunburnt face and faded chevrons on his sleeve, raised a hand. "Hold up there, friend," the corporal called out. His voice was laced with an easy authority. Jake reined in his horse. "Morning, Corporal," he said, forcing a relaxed tone. "Just passing through, heading for the Yuma crossing." The corporal's eyes weren't on Jake. They were fixed on Ilana. He took in her deerskin dress, her long black hair, her Apache features. His gaze was cold and appraising, the look of a man taking inventory. "That is Apache property you have got there," the corporal said, his voice flat. "Territorial Mandate 301. All captured hostiles are wards of the Army, to be assigned to labor camps or sold as indentures. Where is your bill of sale?" "Right here," Jake said, patting his pocket. He had kept the flimsy receipt from the auctioneer in Tombstone. "Bought and paid for. She is my property. I am taking her to my ranch in Mexico." It was a thin lie, but the only one he had. The corporal shared a look with his 2 men. One was older, with a graying beard and weary eyes. The other was a boy, no more than 18, with a nervous energy about him. "That is not how it works," the corporal said, shaking his head slowly. "A bill of sale from a town auction gives you rights to her labor within the territory. It does not give you the right to transport an Army asset across an international border. We have got orders to round up all strays. She comes with us. The world seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and heavy. Jake looked at Alana. She was staring at the corporal's blue uniform, and he saw the nightmare flicker in her eyes. He knew he could not let them take her. He could not send her back to a cage. "I am afraid I cannot let you do that." "Corporal," Jake said, his voice quiet but firm. His hand did not move from its resting place near his gun. The corporal's smile was thin and humorless. "Son, I do not think you are in a position to let or not let us do anything. You will hand her over, or we will take her, and we will arrest you for impeding army business." "She is a human being," Jake said, the words torn from him. "She is a ward of the territory," the corporal corrected him. "And she is coming with us. Now!" He gestured to the young soldier. "Take the rope from her horse." The young soldier hesitated, looking from his corporal to the cold stillness in Jake's eyes. "Now, Private," the corporal barked. That was the moment. The young soldier nudged his horse forward. Jake knew he had seconds before it was all over. In one smooth motion, he pushed Alana off the side of the horse, sending her tumbling into the soft sand. "Run!" he yelled. At the same time, his Colt was in his hand. He did not aim to kill. He aimed for the corporal's shoulder, a shot to disable, to create chaos. The gun bucked in his hand, its roar shattering the desert quiet. The corporal cried out and slumped in his saddle, his right arm suddenly useless. The next moments were a storm of noise and confusion. The older soldier was already firing, his shot going wide as Jake's horse shied and reared. Jake fired back, the bullet kicking up dust near the soldier's horse, trying to spook the animal. The young private, his face a mask of panic, drew his pistol. His hands were shaking. He was not aiming at Jake. He was aiming at Alana as she scrambled to her feet. Jake did not think. He reacted. He swung his gun and fired. The shot was instinctive, born of a desperate need to protect her. The young soldier jerked as if struck by a hammer. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. He dropped his pistol, clutched at his chest, and slid sideways from his saddle, hitting the ground with a soft, final thud. Silence descended, thick and ringing. The older soldier, seeing the boy fall, stared at Jake with a look of horror and rage. Jake knew what he had just done. He had not just shot a man. He had killed a United States soldier. He had crossed a line. He was a wanted man, a murderer. "Go!" he screamed at Alana, who was frozen, staring at the fallen boy. The older soldier was reloading, his movements frantic. Jake fired again, this time at the man's horse. The animal screamed and bolted, throwing the soldier to the ground. Jake spurred his own horse, leaning down and grabbing Alana's arm, pulling her up behind him. He dug his heels in, and the buckskin leaped forward, galloping away from the scene of bloodshed, away from the dead boy and the two wounded soldiers. A bullet whizzed past his ear, then another. He felt a sudden, sharp, burning pain in his side, like a white-hot poker had been thrust into his ribs. He grunted, nearly losing his grip. They rode like the devil was chasing them, which in a way, he was. They left the rolling hills and fled into the jagged, broken country of the Dragoon Mountains, the ancestral home of the Chiricahua. It was the only place they could go, a wilderness of stone and shadow where the law of the white man held little sway. The pain in Jake's side was a constant, searing fire. He could feel the warm stickiness of blood soaking his shirt. The adrenaline that had fueled him began to fade, replaced by a dull, throbbing agony. The world started to swim at the edges, the rocks and sky blurring together. He slumped forward in the saddle, his strength failing. It was Alana who kept them going. She took the reins from his numb fingers, her arm circling his waist to hold him steady. She guided the horse with an unerring instinct, finding paths that were barely visible, navigating the treacherous terrain as if she had been born to it. He drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the pain. the rhythmic motion of the horse, and her solid, unwavering presence behind him. Sometime late in the afternoon, she found a place to hide. It was a shallow cave, hidden behind a curtain of old man's beard lichen, its entrance screened by a cluster of massive boulders. She helped him slide from the horse, his body a dead weight. He collapsed onto the sandy floor of the cave, his breathing ragged. The roles were now completely reversed. He was helpless, and she was in charge. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity that amazed him. She tethered the horse in a small, hidden box canyon where there was a patch of grass. She gathered wood for a fire, building it deep inside the cave where the smoke would be less visible. Then she turned her attention to him. With gentle hands, she cut away his bloody shirt. The bullet had gone in clean, but it had torn through the muscle on his left side, just below his ribs. It was still in there. He was losing a lot of blood. He was beginning to shiver. The first sign of fever. She left the cave and returned with water in his canteen, and her hands were full of herbs and leaves he did not recognize. She made him drink. Then she cleaned the wound as best she could. He gritted his teeth, the pain a nauseating wave that threatened to pull him under. He saw her take his Bowie knife and hold it in the fire, the steel glowing orange. "This will hurt," she said, her voice steady. He just nodded, his jaw clenched. The agony as she probed for the bullet was beyond anything he had ever known. A black tide rose behind his eyes, and he fought to stay conscious. He felt a small, hard object being pulled from the wound, heard it clink as she dropped it on a rock. Then she packed the wound with a green, pungent paste made from the herbs she had gathered and bound it tightly with more strips of cloth from her dress. He lay back, drenched in sweat, his body trembling uncontrollably. Through a haze of pain, he looked at her. Her face, illuminated by the firelight, was calm and serious. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, a healer, his savior. "Killed a man," he rasped, the words catching in his throat. "For you." She met his gaze, her dark eyes holding his. She reached out and placed her cool hand on his feverish brow. "You fight for me," she said softly, and in those 4 words, he heard not an accusation, but a simple, profound statement of fact. A bond, forged in desperation and sealed in blood, had been created between them. Outside the cave, the sun set, and the mountains stood silent guard, hiding the cowboy and the Apache girl from the world that would now hunt them both. Time lost its shape, becoming a murky river of pain and fever. Jake floated in its dark currents, pulled under by waves of heat and swept along by disjointed dreams. He was back on a battlefield in Tennessee, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. He was a boy on his father's farm, the Missouri sun warm on his face. He was in Tombstone, the auctioneer's voice a grating litany of prices and flesh. Through it all, there was a constant presence, a cool hand on his forehead, the taste of bitter tea on his lips, a soft voice humming a melody that was both sad and soothing, an anchor in the swirling chaos of his mind. He surfaced slowly, like a man rising from a great depth. The first thing he became aware of was sound, not the roar of cannons or the jeers of a crowd, but the soft, steady crackle of a fire. Then, another sound, the one that had been his anchor, a voice, singing. He opened his eyes. The light was dim, flickering. He was in the cave, lying on his bedroll. A small, smokeless fire burned near the entrance, its warmth pushing back the mountain chill. Ilana was sitting by the fire, her back to him, mending a tear in his spare shirt with a needle and thread he did not know she had. As she worked, she sang. The song was unlike anything he had ever heard. It was a low, mournful chant, a lament that seemed to hold all the sorrow of her people. It was a song for the dead, for the lost, for the lands that had been stolen. It rose and fell like the breath of the mountain itself, each note filled with a history of pain and a stubborn refusal to be broken. He lay there, listening, and felt the music seep into the marrow of his bones. It was a song of a soul laid bare, and it was the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing he had ever experienced. He must have made a sound, a shifting of his weight, because the singing stopped. She turned, and in the firelight, he saw the concern in her eyes. She put the shirt down and came to his side, kneeling on the sandy floor. "You are awake," she said. It was not a question. He tried to sit up, but a bolt of white-hot pain shot through his side, and he fell back with a groan. "Do not move," she commanded softly. She placed a hand on his chest, a gesture that was both gentle and firm. "The fever is gone, but the wound is still new." She helped him drink some water from the canteen. It was cool and sweet, and it washed the dusty taste of fever from his mouth. He looked at her, truly looked at her for what felt like the first time since the shooting. There were dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes, and she was thinner than before, but her gaze was clear and steady. She had saved him. He knew it with a certainty that went beyond thought. For days, she had fought for his life with herbs, with water, and with the sheer force of her will. "How long?" he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "4 days," she answered. "You sleep, you talk." A flicker of unease went through him. "What did I say?" "You spoke of a brother, of a war. You called out a name? Matthew?" Matthew, his brother, who had died at Shiloh, a ghost he had not spoken of in a decade. He had carried that grief like a stone in his gut for so long, and in his delirium, it had all come pouring out. He felt a flush of shame, of being seen in a way he had never allowed anyone to see him. But looking at her, he saw no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet understanding. She had her own ghosts. She knew what it was to carry the dead. "He was my younger brother," Jake said, the admission costing him more than he expected. She simply nodded, accepting the piece of his past he offered. She rose and returned with a small wooden bowl filled with a thin, warm broth. It smelled of wild herbs and roasted rabbit. She helped him sit up, propping him against his saddle, and held the bowl for him as he drank. The warm liquid was the first real food he had had, and it sent a wave of strength through his depleted body. They sat in a comfortable silence as he finished the broth. The fire crackled and spat, and outside the cave, the wind whispered through the high mountain pines. The world had been reduced to this small, sheltered space, this circle of warmth in the vast, hostile wilderness. The posse that was surely hunting them, the law, the future, all of it seemed a distant dream. The only reality was the fire, the stone walls of the cave, and the woman who sat beside him. She took the empty bowl from him and set it aside. Her eyes were fixed on the fire, the dancing flames reflected in their dark depths. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper, as if she were giving voice to a thought she had held for a long time. "They sold me for $2. The words hung in the air between them, simple, brutal, and heavy with the weight of all that had happened. She did not say it with anger or self-pity. She said it with a kind of stark, elemental clarity, a truth she had examined from all sides and had finally come to understand. She turned her gaze from the fire to him. "You pay $2 for a life?" He looked at her proud, beautiful, wounded face, illuminated in the flickering firelight. He saw the chief's daughter, the storyteller, the healer, the survivor. He saw the woman who had stood beside him in a canyon and fought for her life with a rock. He saw the woman who had pulled a bullet from his body and sung him back from the brink of death. He thought of the 2 silver coins he had dropped into the auctioneer's grimy palm, a meaningless act of conscience that had somehow become the defining moment of his life. A slow, weary smile touched his lips. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly with weakness, and took her hand. Hers was small and calloused, but it fit in his as if it belonged there. "Guess I got a bargain worth more than gold," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. Her fingers tightened around his. A single tear escaped from her eye and traced a path through the dust on her cheek, glittering like a diamond in the firelight. It was not a tear of sadness, but of something else, something deeper. It was a tear of recognition, of being seen, of being valued not as property, but as a person. The touch of her hand, the shared silence, the unspoken feelings that flowed between them. It was more intimate than any kiss. He had lived his life at a distance, keeping the world at arm's length to protect the wounded parts of himself, but with her, in this small cave, there were no more walls. He felt a profound connection, a sense of rightness that defied all logic and law. "Jake," she said, her voice barely audible. It was the first time she had used his name. "I am here," he answered. "The soldiers, the boy, they will hunt you." "They will hunt us," he corrected her gently. He looked down at their joined hands. His was scarred and weathered, the hand of a soldier and a cowboy. Hers was slender and strong, the hand of a woman who knew how to survive. They were from two different worlds, two peoples at war with each other. By every law of God and man, they were enemies. By every measure of the society he had come from, their being together was a sin. He had killed for her. He was a wanted man, an outlaw. His life as he knew it was over. He looked back up at her face, and he knew, with a certainty that silenced all his fears, that he did not care. The life he had been living before he walked into that dusty square in Tombstone had been a ghost's life, a hollow existence of running from the past. He had been dead inside, and he had not even known it. This, he thought, this is real. Protecting her, caring for her, seeing the strength and the beauty in her that the rest of the world was blind to. It was the first thing that had made him feel truly alive in years. It was not a sin. It was a kind of grace. It was his salvation. And he could see in her eyes that she felt it too. He was the man who had bought her, but he was also the man who had fought for her, who had seen her, who had valued her life above his own. In his eyes, she was not a slave. She was a woman. She was Ilana, and that was her salvation. He squeezed her hand. "We will face them together," he said. She nodded, and in the quiet of the mountain cave, surrounded by darkness, they held on to each other. Two outlaws, two survivors, two souls who had found in each other a refuge from a world that had tried to destroy them both. A week turned into two in the high, lonely sanctuary of the cave. Jake's strength returned in slow, stubborn increments, a testament to Ilana's tireless care. She would leave at dawn, silent as a shadow, and return with snares full of rabbits or a handful of edible roots. She changed the dressing on his wound daily, her touch gentle and sure, the herbal poultice she made slowly drawing out the fire and closing the flesh. The scar that remained was a puckered, angry red line, a permanent reminder of the blood that now bound them together. They fell into a domestic rhythm that felt both natural and dreamlike, a life lived in a bubble of stone and firelight, suspended between a violent past and an uncertain future. But they both knew it could not last. The news of their existence seeped into the wider world like a slow poison. It traveled from the wounded corporal's report at Fort Bowie, a tale of a renegade cowboy who had murdered a soldier to protect a runaway Apache. The story was carried by prospectors and traveling salesmen, growing more embellished with each telling. It became a dark frontier legend, whispered over campfires and in dusty saloons. Jake Carver, the traitor, the Indian lover. They learned of their own notoriety in a small, wind-blown settlement called Sulphur Springs, a place that was little more than a stagecoach stop and a general store. They had ridden down from the mountains, their supplies gone. Jake sighed a dull, persistent ache. They needed food and ammunition. Jake waited with the horse in a dry wash while Ilana, her hair covered by a faded sunbonnet he had bought from a passing trader, went into the store. She returned an hour later, her face pale, her movements tight with a barely controlled urgency. In her hands was a sack of flour and coffee, and under her arm was a folded newspaper. She said nothing until they were miles away, hidden in a thicket of cottonwoods. She spread the newspaper on the ground. There, on the front page, was a crude drawing of a man with a grim expression and a drooping mustache. It looked little like him, but the name beneath it was his, Wanted. The headline read in thick, black letters, Jake Carver, for the murder of Private Samuel Hemmings, a reward of $500 offered for his capture, dead or alive. The text below described him as a dangerous outlaw and a former Confederate soldier of questionable loyalties. It went on to say that he was traveling with a female Apache hostile, considered the property of the United States Army. A $50 reward was offered for her return. The casual cruelty of the words, the reduction of her life to a footnote in his crime, made his stomach clench. "They hunt us," Ilana said, her voice flat. "They hunt me," he corrected her. "You are just $50 to them." She looked at him, her dark eyes fierce. "We are together in this," she said, and her tone left no room for argument. They were no longer just fugitives. They were outlaws. The price on his head would draw every bounty hunter and ambitious lawman in the territory. They kept moving, drifting from one forgotten town to the next. They adopted new names, John and Maria Smith, a quiet couple looking for work. Jake found jobs mending fences or breaking horses, his quiet competence speaking for him. Ilana took in laundry or sewing, her skillful hands earning them enough for food and a room in a boarding house. They lived in the shadows, speaking in low voices, never staying in one place for more than a week. The constant vigilance was exhausting. A knife edge of fear they walked every day. Yet, in a strange way, it brought them closer. They learned to read each other's moods in a glance, to communicate danger with a slight touch of the hand. In the small, cheap rooms they rented, they found a sense of home in each other that they had never known anywhere else. It was in the town of Tres Hermanas that his wound, which had been healing cleanly, turned against him. A long day of branding cattle under a hot sun, combined with the constant stress, took its toll. That night, a fever took hold of him, and by morning, the scar on his side was an angry, swollen purple. The infection he had feared was now a reality. Ilana's face was a mask of worry. She knew her herbs could only do so much. He needed a real doctor, but to go to one was to risk everything. They were trapped. As Jake tossed and turned in a feverish sweat, she made a decision. She had heard the women she did laundry with speak of a man on the edge of town. They called him Dr. Harlan. They said he was a colored man, that he kept to himself, and that he was a better doctor than the town's official physician, who was usually drunk by noon. Most importantly, they said he did not ask questions. She half-carried, half-dragged Jake from the boarding house before dawn, saddling their horse in the pre-dawn gloom. She found the house easily. A small, neat adobe cottage with a well-tended garden, a simple wooden sign hung by the door. Harlan, physician. An old black man with skin the color of rich earth and hair like a cloud of white cotton answered the door. His eyes, set in a web of fine lines, were deep and knowing. He looked at Jake, slumped against the doorframe, then at Ilana's desperate face. He simply nodded and stepped aside. "Bring him in," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Dr. Harlan's office was a small, clean room that smelled of carbolic soap and dried herbs. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his hands surprisingly steady for a man of his age. He cleaned Jake's infected wound, lanced it to drain the poison, and stitched it closed with neat, precise sutures. He then applied a clean bandage and gave Jake a bitter-tasting tincture that soon broke the fever. As Jake rested on a cot, Ilana sat with the doctor at a small wooden table. He had made them tea. "He is a strong man," Dr. Harlan said, his gaze resting on Jake. "He will heal, but you cannot keep running like this. It will kill him." "We have nowhere else to go," Ilana said. The doctor looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a profound and weary empathy. "I know," he said softly. "I was born into bondage in Georgia. I ran north when I was a boy. I know what it is to be hunted, to be seen as less than a man." He paused, his gaze drifting to the window. "This land promises freedom, but it rarely delivers, especially for people who look like you and me." He gave them shelter for the rest of the day, a priceless gift of safety. As evening approached, however, a rider came into town. From the window, they saw him. He was a tall, thin man in a crisp uniform, a deputy marshal's badge glinting on his chest. He moved with a cold, predatory confidence. He dismounted in the center of town and began nailing a poster to the wall of the saloon. It was Jake's wanted poster. "You must go," Dr. Harlan said, his voice urgent. "That is Deputy Cole. He has a reputation. He is a hunter, and he does not give up." Jake was still weak, but he knew they could not stay. As darkness fell, they prepared to leave, the doctor pressing a small bag of medical supplies and food into Alana's hands. As Jake was thanking him, the old man placed a hand on his shoulder. "I can see the way you look at her," he said, his voice low. "Protect her. The world will try to tell you that her life does not matter. Do not you ever believe it?" The next morning, they were miles away, hidden in a deep arroyo. Jake was weak, but the fever was gone. They were low on supplies again, and they needed medicine for his pain. Alana insisted on going into the next town alone. She argued that a lone Apache woman buying supplies would attract less attention than the two of them together. Reluctantly, guiltily, Jake agreed. He was in no shape to protect her if trouble started. He watched her ride away, the sunbonnet hiding her features, a feeling of deep unease settling in his gut. He waited all day. The sun crawled across the sky, and the shadows in the arroyo grew long. The unease grew into a gnawing fear. She should have been back hours ago. He saddled the horse, his movements clumsy, his side screaming in protest. He had to go find her. He rode toward the town, his hand never leaving the butt of his Colt. As he topped a low rise that overlooked the main street, he saw it. A small crowd was gathered in front of the sheriff's office. In the center of the crowd was Deputy Cole. His thin lips curved in a triumphant smirk, and beside him, her hands bound in front of her with heavy iron chains, was Alana. Her sunbonnet was gone. Her face was bruised and her dress was torn, but she stood straight and tall, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains. She was a captive again. Jake felt the world tilt on its axis. A cold, killing rage, pure and absolute, rose up in him, burning away his weakness, his pain, his fear. He saw the way the men in the crowd looked at her, their faces a mixture of crude curiosity and smug satisfaction. He saw the glint of the setting sun on Cole's badge and on the iron chains that bound her. He had bought her for $2 to save her from this. He had killed a man to keep her free, and he had failed. He watched as Cole and the local sheriff led her into the jail, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind them. He was alone on the hill, a wounded man with one gun against a town full of enemies. But as he looked at the jailhouse, at the place where they were holding his entire world captive, he felt no despair. He felt only a terrible, clarifying certainty. He would get her back, or he would die trying. The law had taken her. Now, the outlaw would come for her. Night was a shallow grave. Jake did not sleep. He sat in the darkness of the arroyo, the pain in his side a dull, hot coal, and let the rage burn away everything else. It was a clean, cold fire, sharpening his senses, honing his will to a single, lethal point. He had run from the past, from the man he had been in the war, for 10 years. Now, the past had found him. The soldier, the killer, was awake again, and he had a singular purpose. He spent the dark hours planning, his mind a battlefield of tactics and possibilities. He could not take the jail. It was a brick building with one door and barred windows. A fortress, but they would not keep her there forever. Cole was a marshal, not a town deputy. He would take her to a federal court, likely in Tucson. He would transport her. That was when he would be vulnerable. At dawn, Jake did not ride away. He rode closer. He left the horse in a cluster of rocks and made his way on foot to the same rise overlooking the town. He lay on his belly in the dust, his rifle resting on a rock, and he watched. The town came to life slowly. A blacksmith's hammer began its rhythmic clang. A freight wagon rumbled down the main street. Women shook rugs from second-story windows. It was a world of ordinary life, a world he and Alana had only been able to touch for fleeting moments, and a world that was now his enemy. The sun climbed, a merciless white disk in a bleached blue sky. The heat pressed down, making the air shimmer. Noon. The street was nearly empty, the townsfolk seeking shelter from the oppressive heat. This was the time for a public spectacle. The door of the sheriff's office opened. First came the local sheriff, a portly man with a shotgun held awkwardly in his hands. Then two deputies, their faces beaded with sweat. Then Deputy Cole, tall and ramrod straight, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. He was pulling Alana by a chain that led from her bound wrists. She did not stumble. She did not resist. She walked with a regal dignity that made the iron chains and the bruises on her face seem like a desecration. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He raised the rifle, the wooden stock smooth and familiar against his cheek. He sighted down the long barrel, the front sight settling on the center of Deputy Cole's chest. He could end it right now. One shot, but there were four of them. They would cut her down in the crossfire before he could get a second shot off. He needed a better plan. He needed chaos. A stagecoach was scheduled for 1 o'clock. He had seen it on the board outside the station. It was due to pass the livery stable at the far end of the street. Cole was leading Alana toward a wagon parked in front of the jail, a prison wagon. Jake slid backwards from the rise, moving with a pained, silent urgency. He circled around the edge of town, staying low, his eyes fixed on the main street. He reached the alley behind the saloon, across from the livery. He could hear the jangle of harnesses, the snorting of horses. Cole was taking his time, savoring his victory, making a show for the few townspeople brave enough to watch from their windows. Jake took a deep breath, the hot, dusty air searing his lungs. He pulled his Colt, checked it, and holstered it again. He took the Navy Colt, the one he had taught Alana to use, from his belt and tucked it into the front of his pants, a hard lump against his stomach. Then he waited. The rumble of the stagecoach grew louder. It appeared at the end of the street, a cloud of dust billowing behind it. This was his diversion. As the stagecoach drew level with the livery, Jake stepped out of the alley. He fired 2 shots into the air. The effect was instantaneous. The stagecoach horses, already skittish, reared in panic. The driver fought the reins. Cursing, the men guarding the prison wagon spun around, their guns drawn, looking for the source of the shots. The street erupted in confusion. That was all the opening Jake needed. He broke from the alley, running in a low crouch, using the panicked stagecoach for cover. He ran straight for the prison wagon, his rifle in his hands. The first deputy saw him and raised his pistol. Jake fired from the hip. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and the deputy spun around, a red flower blooming on his chest, and fell. Carver Cole roared, his face a mask of fury. He shoved Alana toward the sheriff and drew his gun. Jake kept moving, firing again. The second deputy went down. Clutching his leg, the sheriff, seeing his men fall, lost his nerve. He fired the shotgun wildly, the buckshot tearing splinters from the side of the livery stable. Then he threw the gun down and ran. It was just Jake and Cole. The whole street was their arena. The sun beat down. The air was thick with gun smoke. Cole was a professional. He did not panic. He dropped to one knee, using the wagon wheel for cover, and took careful aim. Jake dived behind a water trough just as a bullet sang past his head, splintering the wood. Jake risked a look over the trough. Cole fired again. The bullet slammed into Jake's left shoulder, a sledgehammer blow that spun him around and threw him to the ground. The rifle flew from his numb fingers. A wave of blackness and searing pain washed over him. He was hit bad. Through a haze, he saw Cole stand up, a thin, cruel smile on his face. He began to walk slowly toward Jake, his pistol leveled. "It is over, outlaw," Cole said, his voice calm. Jake fumbled for the Colt on his hip, but his right hand was slick with his own blood, and his left arm was useless. He was not going to make it. He looked past Cole and saw Ilana. In the chaos, she had been forgotten. She was standing by the wagon, her hands still chained, her face a mask of horror as she watched him die. "No," Jake breathed, the sound lost in the dust. Then something shifted in her. The horror in her eyes was replaced by a cold, hard fire. She looked at the ground where the first deputy had fallen. His pistol lay in the dust, not 10 feet from her. As Cole advanced on Jake, Ilana moved. She ran, her chained hands held out in front of her, and scooped up the heavy pistol. Cole heard the movement and turned. He saw her with the gun, and his eyes widened in surprise. It was a fatal hesitation. She raised the pistol with both hands, the weapon shaking with the effort, the chains rattling. She aimed not with her eyes, but with her entire being. She aimed with the memory of the auction block, with the memory of her people's betrayal, with the terror of the nightmare of the blue coats. She pulled the trigger. The gun roared, a sound that seemed to silence the world. Deputy Cole stopped. He looked down at the dark red stain spreading across his crisp, white shirt. He looked back at Ilana, his expression one of disbelief. Then his eyes went vacant, and he crumpled to the ground, his life dissolving into the red dust of the street. A profound silence fell. Ilana stood over the man she had just killed, the pistol still held in her shaking hands. A wave of nausea and loss washed over her. She had taken a life. She had saved the man she loved, but she had lost a piece of herself in the process. The victory tasted like ash in her mouth. Then she saw Jake, trying to push himself up, a river of blood flowing from his shoulder. The world came rushing back. She dropped the gun and ran to him. At the same moment, the wind began to pick up. The sky to the west, which had been clear moments before, was now a roiling, angry brown wall. A dust storm. She reached him as the first gust of wind hit the town, whipping dust and debris down the street. "Jake," she cried, kneeling beside him. "Go," he gasped, his face pale as death. "Take the horse, run! You are free!" She looked at him, at his shattered shoulder, at the life draining out of him. She looked at the approaching storm, a curtain of salvation. She looked back at his face, at the man who had bought her, who had fought for her, who had killed for her, and who was now trying to die for her. "No," she said, her voice fierce with a love that was stronger than fear, stronger than death. She tore a strip of cloth from her dress and pressed it against his wound. "Get up. You must get up." He tried, but his strength was gone. The storm was almost on them, a roaring, blinding tempest. "Leave me," he pleaded, his voice a ragged whisper. "Save yourself." She leaned close, her face next to his, her unbound hair whipping around them in the wind. She looked him straight in the eye, her own gaze burning with an unshakable resolve. "You bought me for $2, she said, her voice clear and strong above the rising howl of the wind. "I am not leaving you for the world." With a strength she did not know she possessed, she hooked her arms under his, ignoring the chains on her wrists, and began to drag him, pulling him away from the dead, away from the town, and into the heart of the storm. The brown wall of dust descended. swallowing them whole, erasing them from the world. The dust storm was a roaring, brown monster that devoured the world. It was chaos made manifest, a screaming, scouring vortex of sand and wind that erased the sky, the sun, and the town they had left behind. Inside its belly, there was no direction, no sound but the howl of the wind, and no sight but the swirling, suffocating darkness. Jake was a dead weight, a semi-conscious anchor of pain she refused to let go. Ilana dragged him, her muscles screaming, the heavy iron chains on her wrists cutting into her flesh with every step. The world was a nightmare of grit and noise, and she was fueled by a single, desperate thought: live. She found the horse by sheer, blind luck. The terrified animal was huddled against a rock outcropping, its back to the wind, whinnying in fear. It took all her strength to get Jake into the saddle, his body slumping forward over the horse's neck. She found the chains, which Cole had unlocked and then refastened around her wrists, were connected by a single, sturdy link, using a large rock. She laid the link on another flat stone and began to hammer at it, a frantic, rhythmic pounding that was almost lost in the roar of the storm. Sparks flew. Her hands were bruised and bleeding, but she did not stop. The metal groaned, bent, and finally, with a sharp crack, it broke. She was free. She climbed up behind Jake, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, and gave the horse its head, trusting the animal's instinct to find its way out of the maelstrom. For what felt like an eternity, they were tossed in the brown chaos. When the storm finally abated, it did not end, but rather spat them out, leaving them gasping on the edge of a changed world. The sun was a pale, hazy wafer in a sky the color of rust. Everything was coated in a fine red dust. Jake had lost consciousness completely. They were lost, but they were alive. Thirst, a desperate, rasping need, drove them forward. She followed a dry wash, a faint line of hope in the desolate landscape. And late that afternoon, it led them to a miracle, a thin, muddy ribbon of water, fringed with a line of weary-looking cottonwood trees, the San Pedro River. She slid from the horse and practically fell into the slow-moving water, drinking deeply before filling their canteen and bringing it to Jake. She dribbled water onto his cracked lips, and he stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a moment, unseeing, before closing again. She followed the river for another day, leading the horse, her own body a symphony of aches. It was near sunset when she found it, tucked into a bend of the river, almost hidden by a thick grove of mesquite, was a small adobe house. It was old and abandoned, the roof patched with rusty tin, the windows empty black squares, a ghost of a home. But it had 4 walls and a roof. It was shelter. It was sanctuary. Getting Jake inside was the hardest thing she had ever done. He was a tall man, and his inert body was an impossible weight. She half dragged, half carried him through the doorway and onto a dusty cot that stood in one corner. The house had been left in a hurry. A few clay pots sat on a shelf. A broken chair lay by the hearth, and a fine layer of desert dust covered everything, a soft, brown shroud. The days that followed were a long, slow battle for his life. His shoulder wound was festering, the fever returning with a vengeance. This was worse than before, the infection deeper, his life hanging by a more slender thread. She cleaned the wound as Dr. Harlan had shown her stomach churning at the sight and smell, but her hands never faltered. She roamed the riverbanks, her eyes sharp, gathering the healing leaves and roots she knew, grinding them into poultices. She brewed bitter teas that she forced between his lips. She bathed his hot skin with cool river water, whispering to him in her own language, words of encouragement, of healing, of life. She sat with him through the long nights, watching the rise and fall of his chest, her hand resting on his, a silent promise that she would not leave him. He floated in a sea of pain, but this time the darkness was not absolute. He was aware of her, He felt the cool cloth on his brow. He smelled the herbs she burned to cleanse the air. He heard her soft voice, a constant, gentle current beneath the roar of his fever. She was the lighthouse, and he was the ship, lost in the storm, and he navigated by her light, pulling himself, inch by inch, back toward the shore of the living. When the fever finally broke, it left him as weak as a newborn, but he was alive. His eyes, when he opened them, were clear. He saw her sitting by the window, mending his shirt again, the late afternoon sun backlighting her, creating a halo around her dark hair. He saw the exhaustion etched on her face, but he also saw the unyielding strength that held her upright. Love, he realized, was not a soft thing. It was fierce. It was a battle fought in the dark, a stubborn refusal to let go. "Elana," he whispered. She looked up, and a slow, beautiful smile of pure relief spread across her face. Recovery was a slow journey, measured in spoonfuls of broth and the first painful steps from the cot to the door. As his strength returned, the rhythm of their lives changed. The frantic edge of survival softened into a quiet routine of domesticity. The little adobe house, which had been a desperate refuge, began to feel like a home. He was too weak to hunt, so they fished. He showed her how to bait a hook with grubs dug from the riverbank, how to cast the line he had fashioned from a length of cord. They would sit together on the muddy bank for hours, not speaking, just watching the water flow, the silence between them as comfortable as a familiar blanket. When she caught her first fish, a small, silvery trout, her whoop of delight echoed across the water, and he laughed, a real, unrestrained laugh that made his healing shoulder ache in the best possible way. They found a small, fallow garden plot behind the house, choked with weeds but still showing the faint lines of old rows. They cleared it together, pulling the weeds, turning the soil. She had a small deerskin pouch, and from it she produced a handful of seeds corn, squash, and beans that she had carried with her since her capture. A tiny, portable piece of her past, of her home. They planted them with a quiet reverence, an act of faith in the future, a hope that they might be here long enough to see them grow. Their days were filled with the simple, grounding tasks of living. She would wash their clothes in the river, her hands moving with a practiced grace, and spread them on the mesquite bushes to dry in the sun. He, as his arm healed, found an old axe and began to repair the broken corral behind the house. The rhythmic thud of the axe, a steady, reassuring heartbeat in the quiet afternoons. They cooked their meals together in the stone hearth, the smell of wood smoke and roasting fish filling the small house. They learned to tease each other. He complained that she used too much wild onion in her stew. She retorted that he was as clumsy with a fishing line as a bear with a needle. One evening, as they sat outside, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, he tried again to pronounce the Chiricahua word for star. He mangled it so badly that she laughed until tears streamed down her face. He watched her, his heart swelling with a feeling so powerful it almost hurt. He had never known this kind of simple, uncomplicated joy. "One day," he said, his voice soft in the gathering twilight, "I am going to have a small place, a ranch. Nothing fancy, just some good land, a tight house, and a few good horses." He was not sure why he said it. It was a dream he had long ago abandoned. She looked at him, her laughter subsiding, her expression turning thoughtful. "A house by a river?" she asked. "Yes," he said, looking at the dark water sliding by. "A house by a river." They sat in silence for a moment, the dream hanging in the air between them. A beautiful, fragile thing. "And a garden," she added, her voice a near whisper, "with corn and squash." "And a corral full of horses," he said, a smile touching his lips. She looked at him, her dark eyes serious and full of a deep, shared understanding of the world they had survived. "And no one," she said softly, but with a fierce conviction, is sold for $2 anymore." He reached out and took her hand, her fingers laced with his. The dream was impossible. They were fugitives, a man with a price on his head and a woman considered less than human by the law. The peace they had found was borrowed time. But in that moment, sitting in the starlight in front of their ghost of a home, holding her hand, the impossible dream felt more real than the world that was hunting them. The passing of the seasons had brought a fragile, dreamlike peace to the house by the river. Summer's brutal heat had softened into the golden light of autumn. The corn in their small garden stood tall and heavy with ears, and the squash vines had crept across the turned earth, their broad leaves sheltering plump, green fruit. Jake's shoulder had healed into a thick, permanent scar, a dull ache on cold mornings, but his strength had returned fully. He had repaired the old corral, its weathered posts standing straight and true, and had spent his days hunting in the low hills, always returning by evening to the smell of wood smoke and the quiet, comforting presence of Elena. They had built a life from the wreckage of their pasts, a life measured in the rhythm of sunrises and sunsets, of planting and reaping, of shared meals and quiet conversations. The ghosts of Tombstone and the bloody street in Tres Hermanas seemed to belong to another lifetime, another world. Here, there were no wanted posters, no judging eyes, no price tags on a human soul. Here, he was just Jake, and she was just Alana. And in the quiet simplicity of their existence, they had found not just a sanctuary, but a home. He had never known such peace. The peace was shattered on a cool October afternoon by the appearance of a lone rider. Jake was by the river, cleaning a pair of quail. When he saw the figure approaching from the north, his hand went instantly to the colt on his hip. His heart began a low, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. Every stranger was a threat, every rider a potential bounty hunter. He motioned for Alana, who was weeding the garden, to get inside the house. She moved without a word, disappearing into the shadows of the doorway, the rifle surely in her hands by now. Jake stood and waited, his body tense, his eyes narrowed against the sun. As the rider drew closer, a strange sense of familiarity pricked at him. The man sat slumped in the saddle like one who had ridden a long and weary road. The horse was a tired-looking gray. It was not the posture of a lawman or a bounty hunter. When the rider was 100 yards away, Jake recognized him. It was Dr. Harlan. A wave of relief and deep foreboding washed over him. The doctor was a friend, but his presence here could only mean one thing: the outside world. The world they had run from had found them. Jake raised a hand in greeting, and the old doctor returned the gesture. He rode up to the house and dismounted, his joints creaking. His face was etched with a profound weariness, his clothes coated in a thick layer of trail dust. "Jake Carver," the doctor said, his voice a low rumble. "I was not sure I would find you. I was not sure I should." "Doctor," Jake said, his voice tight, "what are you doing here?" Alana appeared in the doorway, the rifle held loosely at her side. She nodded at the doctor, her eyes full of a guarded gratitude. "She looks well," Dr. Harlan observed, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "You both do. This place, it has been good to you." He looked around at the tidy garden, the repaired corral, the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. "But you cannot hide from the world forever. Son, the world has a long memory." They sat inside the small house, the afternoon light slanting through the dusty window. Alana served the doctor cool water from the river, her movements silent and graceful. The old doctor drank deeply. Then he looked at Jake, his expression grave. "I have come from Tucson," he began. "I have a cousin there who works as a clerk for a territorial judge. I have been listening, asking questions in the right places. The Army is tired of hunting you. Carver, the death of Deputy Cole made you a legend, but it also made you a problem they want solved. It is expensive, sending patrols into the mountains after one man. Jake said nothing, his hands resting on the table, his knuckles white. "Private Hemmings, the boy you shot," the doctor continued, his voice gentle but insistent. "His father is a man of some influence back east. He wants justice, or at least what he calls justice. But the army wants to close its books. So, a deal has been offered, a quiet deal, arranged by the judge." Dr. Harlan paused, and the silence in the small room was as heavy as a shroud. "They are offering you a pardon," he said. The word hung in the air, unbelievable and dangerous. A pardon, freedom, a life, the dream of a ranch, of a future, a dream he had shared with Ilana in the starlight. Suddenly felt like a real, intangible thing. He could feel its shape, its weight, but he could also feel the hook hidden inside the bait. "What is the price?" Jake asked, his voice a low growl. Dr. Harlan's gaze faltered. He looked down at his old, wrinkled hands. "The pardon is for you, Jake, for the murder of the soldier, for the death of the deputy. They will clear your name. You can walk away a free man." He took a deep breath. "But only if you surrender the Apache woman. They want her returned, to be made a ward of the territory, as the law demands." The air went out of Jake's lungs. The beautiful dream shattered into a million pieces of sharp, glittering glass. He looked at Ilana. She was standing by the hearth, her back to them, but he could see the sudden, rigid tension in her shoulders. He felt a wave of nausea, a self-loathing so profound it threatened to choke him. The world had presented him with the same rotten choice it always had: his life, his freedom, in exchange for hers. "No," Jake said, the word a piece of granite in his throat. "There is no deal." "Son, you have to listen to me," the doctor pleaded, leaning forward. "Think about what I'm saying. A life. A real life. You can have that ranch you always wanted. You can be a citizen again. If you refuse, they will never stop hunting you. They will send more men, harder men than Cole. They will hound you to the ends of the earth. You might last another year, maybe 2, but one day, a bullet will find you. And what happens to her then? What kind of life is this for her? Always running, always hiding, waiting for the sound of hoofbeats in the distance." Every word was a hammer blow, striking at the very foundation of the life he had tried to build. The doctor was not wrong. The peace they had found was an illusion, a brief pause in a war they could never win. Was it love to condemn her to that life, to a life that would end with her watching him die in the dust, or with her being dragged back to a cage? "It is not a life if I have to buy it with her soul," Jake said, his voice shaking with a rage he could barely control. "It is just another kind of cage. I will not do it. I will not." "What is your choice then?" Dr. Harlan asked, his voice full of a weary sorrow. "To die, to take her with you." "We will go further south," Jake said, his mind racing. "Into Mexico, deeper. They will never find us." "There is no place deep enough, son," the doctor said sadly. "Not in this world." The conversation ended there. There was nothing more to say. Dr. Harlan stayed for another hour, a silent, mournful guest. Then he mounted his tired horse and rode away, a ghost returning to a world they no longer belonged to. A heavy, poisonous silence descended upon the house. Jake could not look at Ilana. He felt ashamed, tainted by the choice he had been offered. He did not tell her the details of the deal. He could not bring himself to speak the words. He paced the small room like a caged animal, the doctor's logic a torment in his mind. He went outside and chopped wood with a savage fury, the axe rising and falling, each blow a strike against an enemy he could not see. Ilana was quiet, her face an unreadable mask. She prepared their evening meal, her movements as fluid and precise as always, but he could feel her watching him. The peace between them was broken, replaced by the ugly intrusion of the outside world. That night, sleep did not come easily. Jake lay on their cot, his mind a battlefield. He imagined a life of freedom, the sun on his face, a deed to his own land in his pocket. Then he imagined the price, Ilana, her hands in chains again, her eyes full of the same emptiness he had seen on the auction block. The images warred in his soul, tearing him apart. He finally drifted into a fitful, exhausted sleep, the battle undecided. He awoke with a start just before dawn. The air in the room was cold. The place beside him on the cot was empty. A primal fear, cold and sharp, shot through him. He sat up. The house was silent, too silent. He scrambled to his feet and looked around. Her few belongings were gone. He rushed to the door. The sky was a pale, pre-dawn gray. He looked toward the corral. One of the horses was missing. A dawning, terrible understanding washed over him. She had been by the hearth. She had not been looking away. She had been listening. She had heard everything. She had left to save him from the choice. She had sacrificed her own freedom, her own life, so that he would not have to. She had taken the decision out of his hands, freeing him in the only way she knew how. A raw, guttural cry was torn from his throat. He did not think. He did not plan. He acted. He threw a saddle on the remaining horse, his hands shaking with fury and fear. He grabbed his rifle, a canteen, and a strip of jerky. He did not know where she was going. Perhaps back to the mountains. Perhaps to turn herself in. It did not matter. He had to find her. As he rode out, the wind began to rise, a low, mournful moan that swept down from the mountains. The sky, which had been clear moments before, was now streaked with angry gray clouds that scudded across the horizon. The air grew heavy, charged with a wild energy. A storm was coming, a great, violent desert tempest, the kind that could reshape the land and swallow a lone rider whole. It was a test. The world was throwing everything it had at them. Nature and man aligned against them. He spurred the horse, leaning low over its neck, and rode headlong into the gathering storm. His heart a single, desperate prayer, Ilana. The storm was a living thing, a beast of wind and sand that clawed at Jake and his horse. He rode blind, his bandana pulled over his face, the world a roaring, grit-filled chaos. He was not tracking her with his eyes, but with his heart, with a desperate instinct that pulled him north, the direction a person would take to surrender. He followed the faint indentation of the riverbank, a path he prayed she was also following. The wind tried to tear him from the saddle, and the sand scoured his skin, but the storm inside him was greater. The thought of her, alone and riding toward a cage, was a pain sharper than any physical wound. Hours passed. The heart of the storm moved on, leaving behind a wounded, groaning landscape under a bruised and turbulent sky. The wind still howled, but the air began to clear in patches. It was in one of these moments of clarity that he saw a single line of hoofprints in the freshly laid sand, heading north. Hope, fierce and sharp, pierced through his despair. He spurred his weary horse, his eyes now scanning the horizon. He found her an hour later, not in the open, but in a grove of cottonwoods by a bend in the river. She was not alone. 3 men were with her, bounty hunters. He recognized their type instantly hard. Lean men with dead eyes and greedy hands, the human vultures who fed on the misery of others. They had her horse, and she was standing with her back against a thick cottonwood tree, cornered. One of the men held a rope. $50 is $50, one of them was saying, his voice a lazy drawl that carried on the wind. And the $500 for him is just a bonus. He will come for you, squaw. They always do. Jake slid from his saddle, his rifle in his hand. The wind and the rustling of the cottonwood leaves covered the sound of his approach. He moved like a ghost through the brush, his body a single, focused instrument of death. The love he felt for her, the quiet peace they had built, had been forged into something else. Now, a cold, hard resolve. He would not let them take her. The world would not have her. He rested the rifle barrel on the fork of a mesquite branch, took a steadying breath, and aimed. The man with the rope was laughing. Jake squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was sharp and clean. The laughing man grunted, a look of surprise on his face, and pitched forward into the sand. The other two spun around, their guns coming up. One fired wildly into the brush. The second, a big man with a thick beard, was smarter. He grabbed Alana, pulling her in front of him as a shield. "Carver," he roared, "you show yourself, or she gets it." Jake's blood ran cold. He could not shoot. He was trapped. Ilana did not struggle. She looked past the man holding her, her eyes searching the trees, and for a moment, her gaze met Jake's. In her eyes, he saw not fear, but a message, a silent command. Then she acted. She drove her elbow back, hard, into the big man's ribs. As he grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second, she dropped to the ground, rolling away. It was all the chance Jake needed. He fired again. The big man staggered back, clutching his chest, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. He fell, his eyes wide with the final, ultimate surprise. The third man was already running, scrambling for his horse. He was a coward. Jake did not bother with the rifle. He drew his Colt as he stepped out from the trees, a specter of vengeance walking into the clearing. The man saw him and tried to raise his pistol. Jake fired once. The man dropped. It was over. The clearing was silent, save for the mournful cry of the wind in the trees. Jake stood there, his gun smoking, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked at Alana. She was safe. That was all that mattered. But it was not over. A fourth man, hidden in the brush on the other side of the clearing, a man Jake had not seen, rose up. Jake saw the glint of a rifle barrel just as Alana screamed his name. He turned, raising his Colt, but he was too late. The world exploded in a starburst of white-hot pain. The bullet hit him square in the chest, a massive, tearing impact that lifted him off his feet and threw him backwards. He landed hard, the air driven from his lungs. He heard another shot, the sharp crack of his own rifle, which Alana had scooped up. He saw the fourth man fall. Then the world began to fade, the edges turning a soft, blurry gray. He felt her beside him, her hands on his face. "Jake," she was saying, her voice a desperate, broken thing. "Jake, no." He tried to speak, but a warm, coppery taste filled his mouth. He looked up at her beautiful, beloved face, framed by the wind-tossed leaves of the cottonwoods. He had done it. She was free. He had not failed. She was dragging him, pulling him toward the river. The water was cold, a shock that momentarily cleared his head. She held him, his head and shoulders cradled in her arms, as the slow current of the San Pedro washed the blood away in dark, swirling clouds. The water, the giver of life, was now his witness. "You have to stay," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, mingling with the river water. "You have to stay with me. The house by the river, the garden." He managed to lift a hand, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek. He smiled, a faint, bloody smile. He had his ranch, he had his home. It was right here, in her eyes. The peace he had felt in their small adobe house was nothing compared to the profound, absolute peace that was settling over him now. His race was run. He had fought his last battle, and he had won. She leaned down, her face close to his, her tears falling on his skin. "You changed my life, Cowboy," she whispered, her voice thick with a love that would outlast the mountains. He heard her, and in the final moment, as the gray faded to black, he knew that she had changed his, too. She had taken a broken, empty man and given him a reason to live, and finally, a reason to die. The years passed as the river flows, sometimes in a rush, sometimes so slow you can barely see the current. The violence of the territory eventually tamed itself, the hard edges worn smooth by time and the slow, steady march of homesteaders. The legends of the old outlaws faded, becoming stories told to children by the fire. But in a quiet bend of the San Pedro River, a new story was being written. The small adobe house was no longer a ghost. It was a home, filled with the sounds of life. Ilana lived there, a woman whose quiet dignity was as much a part of the landscape as the ancient cottonwood trees. The lines of sorrow on her face had been softened by the lines of laughter. She was no longer running. She was a teacher. A hand-painted wooden sign hung from a post near the front door. It was weathered by the sun and the rain, but the letters were still clear. They read, "The $2 Schoolhouse." Every morning, children would come. They were the children of Mexican ranchers, of white homesteaders, and the mixed-blood children from the nearby Apache reservation. They came with bare feet and curious eyes. In the single, sunlit room of the adobe house, Ilana taught them. She taught them to read from old, tattered books. She taught them to write their names in the dirt with a stick. She taught them to add and subtract. But more than that, she taught them what she had learned in the heart of the desert, in the crucible of love and loss. She taught them that a person's worth is not measured in dollars, that courage and compassion are the only currencies that matter, and that a life, any life, is a treasure more precious than gold. Sometimes, in the evenings, when the children were gone and the house was quiet, she would walk down to the riverbank, to the spot where the old cottonwoods grew. She would stand and watch the water flow by, her thoughts on the cowboy who had changed her life. She had buried him there, under the tallest tree, and sometimes she felt his presence in the whisper of the wind through the leaves. A quiet, steadfast love that had not died, but had simply become a part of the land. His sacrifice had not been an end. It had been a beginning. It was the seed from which this new life, this place of peace and learning, had grown. His love was the foundation upon which the $2 Schoolhouse was built, a legacy not of blood and dust, but of hope. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Remember to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.